Welcome to Crow Canyon's Thursday webinar. We are extremely excited for our friend and long-term partner who is going to be speaking today. But before I introduce Dr. Glowacki and her talk, just a couple of our introductory slides. We always begin with our land acknowledgement. Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Hickory Apache people on whose traditional homelands our institution sits. Our mission-related work is not possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future, and we respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. We are grateful to all Indigenous people, and we support the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. As you're probably hearing on most of our webinars and on Facebook and other ways that you have of staying in touch with us, we are celebrating 40 years this year in 2023. We have the occasional 40th anniversary webinar topics, such as our one today and the one a couple of weeks ago with Ricky and Bill and Tim and Mark. We have our 40th anniversary conference in October. We are pretty much full and now waitlisted, but please do, if you would like to come, please jump on that wait list. And we have our new book coming out with many of the Crow Canyon staff and associates, such as Donna, who have authored chapters in our new book titled Research, Education, and American Indian Partnerships at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, which should be coming out shortly. Please jump on our website for more information. And thank you to all of our viewers. This is a free webinar series. We could not keep it going without all of the donations from all of you. We are incredibly grateful for your generosity. As we pop onto the Zoom, please remember to put your questions in the Q&A if possible, so that we can sort through them easier and they don't get lost in the chat. We are live streaming on Facebook if you get annoyed with Zoom, and this talk will be up on our YouTube channel after we are finished. We have some really fun webinars coming up. We've got Pueblo on the Plains, the merchant site of southeastern New Mexico, and new insights into the Plains-Pueblo relationships during the 14th century with John Speth and Miles Miller. And then our longtime friend, Scott Ortman, will be speaking on August 3rd with what all of us can learn from the old ones, which is, I think, derived from his chapter in the forthcoming book, which is really, really fantastic. So I'm hoping that you can tune in for both of these. Without further ado, it is my honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Donna Glowacki, who is an associate professor of anthropology at University of Notre Dame and a longtime research associate of Crow Canyon and Mesa Verde National Park and Notre Dame's Environmental Change Initiative. She has been working in the Southwest for 30 years, researching how societies change. She has conducted fieldwork at 89 of the largest ancestral Pueblo archaeological sites in the Mesa Verde region. There is just about nothing that she doesn't know. Her book, Living and Learning, A Social History of Regional Depopulation in 13th Century Mesa Verde. If you have not read her book, I highly recommend it, and it explores social change and other issues related to the ancestral Pueblo people of the Mesa Verde region. Dr. Glowacki's research has been featured in Nature, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the award-winning Mesa Verde Voices podcast, and in Craig Child's book, House of Rain. And her current research, where she is right now in Mesa Verde National Park, focuses on large ancestral Pueblo village organization and how it changed between 900 and 1290. At Spruce Tree House and Farview community, with particular attention to how their ancient water management strategies were used in adapting to their high desert environment. Something incredibly relevant at this particular moment as we live here in the Southwest with some high temperatures and low waters today. Thank you so much for joining us. And I am going to stop my share and turn it over to your superior technology.
Okay, I'm good to go.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Liz, for that kind introduction. And hi, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your summer to come and visit with us for this next hour or so. So as Liz was saying, this is a talk that's in honor of the 40 years of Crow Canyon's research, and it focuses specifically on community center archaeology. It is based on the chapter that is in the book that Liz was just talking about, as well as an SAA presentation that we did in the spring. And this was really co-authored with Grant Coffey and Mark Varian. So this talk is really on behalf of them as well. It does celebrate the 40 years of sustained research by Crow Canyon Archaeological Center archaeologists, and it focusing on Ancestral Pueblo community organization. Today, I'm also very pleased to be giving the webinar from the VRC at Mesa Verde National Park, because the park has also contributed to and supported Crow Canyon's research on community centers, which I'll be talking about more soon. So what we know as Crow Canyon Archaeological Center today began with Ed Berger's Crow Canyon School that was then merged with Stuart Struever's Center for American Archaeology in 1983. All right, sorry about that. So by this time, Struever had already established Campsville in Illinois, and had been strongly advocating that for American archaeology to be effective, it really needed to be able to do three important things. One was to be able to conduct long-term, multidisciplinary, regionally focused research. And two, in order to do this research, it needed to be done in conjunction with public education programs involving K-12 students and also adults. And finally, he felt that this research needed to be funded through private funds as a nonprofit organization, rather than short-term federal grants and academic programs. And so an important part of Stuart Struever's vision was creating a regional institution in the Southwest that could support and sustain this long-term research involving teams of specialists. And voila, we have Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. Now, given all of this background, perhaps nothing illustrates the value of his vision more than Crow Canyon's sustained research into Central Mesa Verde region community centers, which are the largest ancestral Pueblo sites in the region, many with the longest occupation histories. So today I'm going to be discussing the 40-year history of research into community centers that has been done and sustained by Crow Canyon and many, many others. I'll also be describing the current database of community centers that we have, while noting some of the large-scale patterns in how community centers changed over time. And then I will highlight just a few of the things that we have learned. Okay. Crow Canyon researchers define a community center as having at least one of the following: 50 or more structures, so that's all of the structures in a settlement, 9 or more pit structures, and or public architecture. 9 pit structures is the minimum number of pit structures for defining a community center, because this number suggests that a population of at least about 50 people were living in these villages. However, smaller sites can also qualify if they have either public architecture or a high number of rooms to reach that 50-room number. So basically, community centers really are just the largest ancestral Pueblo villages that formed in the Mesa Verde region. And we've been focusing on the entire occupation from 600 to 1290. Currently, archaeologists have recorded about 21,000 Pueblo and residential sites in the Central Mesa Verde region, which I have over here for you. Only about 263, which is about 1% of these 21,000 sites, meet the criteria for community centers. Thus, when compared to the tens of thousands of smaller residential sites in the region, their size, longevity, and the presence of public architecture really stands out and attests to the important role community centers played in structuring social, ceremonial, economic, and political activities in communities and regionally. And understanding this role has been and continues to be a really important part of Crow Canyon's research. All right, before getting into the details, on behalf of the institution, I would like to be sure to acknowledge and thank all who have contributed to this effort. Over the last 40 years, Crow Canyon's community center research has integrated many different projects and involved numerous Crow Canyon staff members, collaborators, many of which are listed here, and also indigenous consultants. Additionally, many generous landowners have given permission for us to study sites on their property. The excavations that Crow Canyon has done at some of these community centers was also supported by citizen scientists and educational groups over the years. The expertise and knowledge of numerous colleagues not directly involved in the project has been essential for the success of this sustained research and has helped identify centers and added critical historical and archaeological information. This research over the last 40 years has also been supported by many funding sources, and they are listed here. And again, I just want to say that we're really grateful for all who have assisted with this research. Okay, so for a brief history of the 40 years of community center research, for all intents and purposes, community center research pretty much began when Crow Canyon began in 1983. Part of the reason for this is that at this time, community organization had become a really important concept and theoretical focus that was being explored across the Southwest at many different projects and many different ways and institutions. Additionally, one of the first projects at Crow Canyon was the Sand Canyon Pueblo Mapping and Testing Project, initiated by Chuck Adams, Bruce Bradley, and Mike Adler in 1983. Although Crow Canyon excavations at Sand Canyon Pueblo and the 9 community centers excavated thereafter were not at the outset envisioned as part of this larger community center research project, they were an important foundation that provided invaluable information and data for interpreting the centers, most of which we only know from the surface indications. Technically, the first explicitly community center focused effort was the initial inventory of the largest ancestral Pueblo villages that was produced as part of the Winter-Gren funded Pueblo Cultures in Transition Conference in 1990. And that was organized by Mike Adler and several others. The goal of this conference was to broadly characterize the distribution of all the large sites in the greater Southwest. So this was a huge effort between 1150 to 1350, and this is also known as the Pueblo III period. And I've got the cover of the volume that came out of this shown. This conference was actually an important milestone for Crow Canyon's history because it was the first time the center took on this regional and macro-regional research. For the Mesa Verde contribution to this conference, a team of archaeologists led by Bill Leip and Mark Varian compiled the initial list of centers in southwestern Colorado and southeastern Utah. This initial inventory became an important foundation for guiding future research in the region and identifying areas with missing information. For example, later in the 1990s, the Village Mapping Project used the list to identify 30 community centers in need of more work because we didn't know enough about them. This project, directed by Bill Leip, Rich Wilshusen, and Scott Ortman, took aerial photographs of 30 centers, mapped 15 of them using a total station, so got more details about the architectural features, conducted in-field pottery and lithics analysis, and was able to nominate 6 of the centers to the National Register of Historic Places, which is really important, and it also takes a lot of work to do that. All right, so, and then in turn, based on this information, that was generated by the Village Mapping Project, it was used by Crow Canyon then to select sites for its research program. Crow Canyon conducted excavation at 3 of these centers, and they're shown here: Woods Canyon, Yellow Jacket Pueblo, and Headley. And this program became known as the Village Testing Project. You can see how we're going with these descriptive titles. This is about when I joined Crow Canyon, first in 1994 as an intern at Castle Rock Pueblo with Ricky Lightfoot and Kristen Kuckelman, and then as a co-director of the Yellow Jacket Pueblo Testing Project in 1995. Next, the community center database was expanded by 2 dissertation projects. The first was Mark Varian's research in the late 90s, focusing on 135 centers dating from 950 to 1300, focused on the central Mesa Verde region. He analyzed their catchments, the areas that village residents use frequently for agriculture, resources, and interaction. And he showed how successive centers formed persistent communities lasting centuries and how the distances between them changed over time. My 2006 dissertation included the entire northern San Juan region, so it also involved northwest New Mexico in addition to southeast Utah, and it focused specifically on the late centers that dated from 1150 to 1280. And it nearly doubled the number of centers that had been considered by previous studies, so about 253. I found strong differences among eastern and western Mesa Verde centers that shaped how migration and regional depopulation unfolded in the mid to late 1200s. Now, possibly the most concerted effort to refine and expand the community center data was in conjunction with the Village Ecodynamics Project, which went from 2000 to 2014. The VEP, as it's known, was a long-term multi-institutional and multidisciplinary research program that was directed by Tim Kohler, Mark Varian, and several others. And that this project examined the relationship between ancestral Pueblo people and their environments spanning from 600 to 1600. It was funded by 2 NSF grants, and the VEP had 2 different phases. In each of the phases, there was also a community center field survey that I directed to systematically expand and improve community center data in Southwest Colorado. This survey conducted field work at 71 centers, making new maps, recording features, and analyzing pottery. An important part of the success of VEP2 was the collaboration with Mesa Verde National Park to include the sites within the park boundaries in this total inventory, because at this point that hadn't taken place, and it has made a much fuller understanding of our regional dynamics. By the end of the VEP, community center research had produced a database with information on 172 centers in Southwest Colorado. Since then, community center research has continued through Crow Canyon testing and preservation work in both the Basket Maker community and the Northern Chaco and Outlier projects. The community center survey inventory has also continued through the community center reassessment project. In 2016, to start this phase of the research, we critically re-examined the VEP2 generated demographic estimates for each community center and identified community centers that still were in need of new field work. Perhaps there wasn't adequate pottery analysis to really take advantage of the analysis. So we then made plans to go to the field to improve these data. In 2017, in the field, we were able to visit 3 centers in Mesa Verde National Park, most of which were on Park Mesa, and 9 centers that were in either Canum or on private land to broaden. And some of these places were places that we had hoped to get to in the past, but weren't able to. So it was really great to be able to add those to the inventory. For other centers, we've reanalyzed and are analyzing legacy pottery collections, and we continue to visit centers with poor pottery data to do in-field analysis as we can. Crow Canyon has also assisted the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Historic Preservation Office and Terry Knight and Paleo West in creating preservation plans for 9 additional community centers that were on Ute Mountain Ute lands. This field work created new maps, also assessed the architecture, conducted pottery analysis, and in some cases, these were the first formal documentation efforts at some of these sites. So that was a lot of history, but in total, it has resulted in this database that now contains 325 community centers, and you can see the distribution here. And 263 of these are in Southwest Colorado, and this is where the main focus has been. All right, so I'm gonna now kind of talk about some of the broader trends over time that you can see at this kind of larger scale. The distribution of all the community centers in the database illustrates how highly concentrated they were in the Mesa Verde core, and highlights differences among community centers during the early and late aggregation cycles. The apparent site density is in part related to sample bias, especially with respect to Southeast Utah and Northwest New Mexico. But we also believe centers were concentrated in particular areas due to favorable environmental characteristics and compelling social dynamics that affected where people wanted to live or could live. Okay, so for the early cycle community centers, this is the aggregation cycle that happens between 600 and 900. The database includes 49 early centers that are dispersed across the central Mesa Verde region. Two subregions in particular, and the arrows are pointing at them. Dolores is the northern cluster, and the Mesa Verde Cuesta have higher site densities than the rest of the region. Both locales have advantages that support more people in larger villages, including access to highly productive agricultural land or large game access. And then there's favorable precipitation and growing season and access to water, both on the Cuesta and along the Dolores River. For the Mesa Verde Cuesta, this strong early cycle of aggregation and center formation is an important foundation for the high population density on the Cuesta during the Chaco, the subsequent Chaco era between 900 and 1150. That's evident at places like Farview Community and the Moorfield Great House Village. The early centers include villages like McPhee and Grass Mesa villages in the Dolores River Valley, and then, as mentioned, Farview, and then also the Badger House communities in Mesa Verde National Park, which many of you may have visited. On average, early centers had 103 rooms and 10 room blocks, just to give you a sense of the size, but that ranges around that. 35% of the early centers have public architecture, the majority of which are great kivas. And 4 of the centers actually have 2 great kivas, suggesting either longer occupations, intensified use of public architecture, or perhaps social divisions and groupings within the village. That only 1/3 of the largest villages at this time have public architecture suggests conditions promoting aggregation were not widely shared, and there were different modes of community integration and identity construction, or ways of becoming a community. Okay. So that's the early aggregation cycle. For the late aggregation cycle, this is the community centers that formed between 900 and 1280. So it includes both the Chaco era and the Mesa Verde Classic period. The location and distribution of late community centers is really different, as you can see, from the early cycle, especially with the number of them, right? There's 230 late centers, so there's nearly 5 times as many centers in the late aggregation cycle. So they're definitely more numerous, which also translates to population levels and density of these sites and of these villages together is clearly increasing. And so aggregation was really playing a major role in social dynamics during this time. So in the late aggregation cycle, it also became more common to situate settlements on the canyon rim, the canyon heads, and on talus slopes than upland settings. And there are also different ways of being in these communities, as interregional differences point to varying social organization and relationships among the largest villages. The areas with the highest density of centers are at these locations, the head of and along canyons and canyons of the ancient national monument, and also on the Mesa Verde Cuesta. So again, you can see that the occupation of the Cuesta really stands out in the region, as well as kind of the area around Canyon of the Ancients. On the Mesa Verde Cuesta, if you kind of squint, you can kind of make out a northern cluster of community centers and a southern cluster of community centers. The northern group of centers were actually depopulated by the early 1200s for the most part, which is interesting. And the ones in the south are really dominated by the cliff dwellings, which were the most populated in the mid to late 1200s. Also of note is the somewhat even spacing between the large centers in the Montezuma Valley. So that's that line of 4 large centers, 4 or 5 large centers, but that goes between the 2 clustered areas that are highlighted there. And Jim Potter and others have a chapter in the 40th book that's just come out that talks about this as well. Also in southeastern Utah, there are fewer centers overall, and you can really see that here in the image. And they predominantly occur along drainages, and they had wider spacing. Now, probably in the eastern part of this area, they were also predominantly near water sources for the most part and along drainages, but they're obviously much more concentrated. So there is a difference there, but there needs to be sort of more work in the West to kind of pull all this together and see, because there just hasn't been as much of the inventorying done in the Western part. So I'm just worried about sampling bias there. So I don't want to overinterpret that. Okay, although many late centers are larger than the largest center in the early period, others minimally meet the 50-room threshold. So there's a little bit of variation there. On average, late centers have 95 rooms and 6 room blocks. So really, it's about the same average number of rooms as the early centers, but they seem to be packed into fewer room blocks. So you can see this sort of increasing, they're just becoming increasingly compact. An important development in the 1200s is the change in village layout from what had been a standard San Juan pattern of linear room block arrangements that you can see here in the yellow jacket example. And it goes from this to a more aggregated, much more compact and inwardly focused village configuration you can see here in the Yucca House reconstruction. The mix of village types in the 1200s suggests different types of social and religious organizations that were emerging as people coalesced into increasingly larger villages. So people were working things out in different ways. These changing and intensifying social dynamics are also evident in the frequency, distribution, and diversity of public architecture, including great houses, great kivas, plazas, and multi-walled structures. Of the 230 late centers, about 15% have at least one great house. Over a quarter have a great kiva, about a third have plazas, and the multi-walled structures are more rare at 7%. The type of public architecture present varies through time and corresponds to broader cultural developments. Most great houses are built in the Chaco era during its prime, between the 1000s and the early 1100s. The multi-walled structures were constructed in the early 1200s to late 1200s. Great kivas were prevalent throughout the period, but common between 1000 and 1225. And then plazas after 1225 tend to become larger and more defined in the aggregated villages. The expanded use of public architecture shows that significant cultural changes were occurring that emphasized communal gatherings and expressed different ideas about social and ceremonial practices. Okay, so for the last phase, the terminal community centers, so these are the centers that post-date, basically 1250. There are 81 in the database. On average, the late centers have 121 rooms and 5 room blocks. So on average, they have the most rooms of all of the periods, but they're even more compact because there's fewer defined room blocks. These centers were among the last locations to be depopulated, suggesting there may have been some sense of security or sunk cost investment afforded by centers as social and climatic conditions deteriorated. These terminal centers were most often located, again, on in those canyon settings. And in addition to the rims and the canyon heads, you've got the alcoves that are being more heavily populated at this time. There were slightly fewer terminal community centers in southeastern Utah, and they were markedly smaller than those in southwest Colorado, and that is also very evident on the image here. Okay. In southwestern Colorado, Yellow Jacket and Goodman Point Pueblos are the largest, followed by Hampton, Sand Canyon Pueblo, and Yucca House, and Headley Main Ruin is the largest terminal period center in southeastern Utah. So that wraps up the overall patterns that we see at this kind of bigger scale. And in addition to these trends in settlement pattern, we've also learned a lot about many things, and I can't go into all of these because it would take a long time, and probably each one of these topics could be given by different experts and be a whole webinar. But to highlight just a few, in terms of village layout and construction, in addition to the changes I was just talking about from the linear to aggregated room blocks. We have also learned more about how many of the villages had intentional and planned layouts, implying centralized leadership that directed placement, organization, and construction. For example, the shape of Sand Canyon Pueblo was planned and defined by the outer enclosing wall that was a continuous construction to form that U-shape. And then there was also large-scale landscape positioning of architecture, creating architectural symmetries and celestial alignments. And you can see some of the examples of studies that have been focused on this here. For social and political organization, public architecture, the great kivas, great houses, multi-wall structures, and plazas, organize village life by their position and how they structure relationships that can be at times more inclusive and also other times exclusive, both within and between the villages. These structures socially, ceremonially, and politically increased interaction not only within these centers, but among them and other settlements, and attracted people. And it does turn out that the community centers with public architecture were the largest of the centers in the database. And there's also variation among centers, with some being distinctively larger than others, suggesting settlement and social hierarchies between and within centers, as well as the potential for interconnected polities of villages in the central Mesa Verde region, especially during the Chaco era. In terms of agricultural productivity, we've learned, given the populations at these large villages and the reconstructed patterns of precipitation and climate, that they were sensitive to climate-driven variation in agricultural potential, and food insecurity was an issue at different times and for different places, but especially during the mid 1100s and the mid to late 1200s. Many villages were operating at the brink, especially during these periods, as growing inequities in access to reliable food, agricultural yields created increasing vulnerabilities, which so it was a dynamic that people were dealing with on a daily basis, as are many people today. There was also a tendency for villages and population to not only expand to fit the available space, but also to move into more marginal areas in the good years, which then of course would leave them much more vulnerable in the bad years. In terms of trade and social networks, we've also learned that over time, among the largest villages, there was an increase in the intensification and localization of interregional networks. For example, in both pottery and lithics, we see that extra-local exchanges and resource procurement were more frequent at smaller sites than the community centers. And so people were focused more locally, with the exception of pottery procurement at Yellow Jacket Pueblo, which is interesting and may reflect that it had a different, perhaps more prominent socioeconomic and thus religious and political status in the Mesa Verde core. We've also learned a lot more about the context of aggregation and immigration. We have a better understanding first of the persistence and resilience of these villages, with well over half of them enduring a century or more. And as I noted before, in the late 1200s, in many cases, the largest villages were some of the last places that Pueblo people were living before emigrating the region. We also know that in some cases, Yellow Jacket Pueblo is an example, the community centers became really desirable places to be during drought times, and people gathered together in these places. But at other times, the conditions made it impossible for the community centers to persist, and people moved on. And yet ultimately what Crow Canyon sustained research has helped us better understand is that despite the similarities and connections, each of these large ancestral Pueblo villages was its own living place with its own history, filled with generations of families living together, cooperating, changing, disagreeing, adapting, and striving. And so from this presentation, you can see that the community center database is used by many researchers. I really only hit the tip of all that's been done and learned with this information here. The community center database has also been incorporated into other large-scale research initiatives, including Cyber Southwest and the Chaco Research Archive. The work on continuing to learn more and expand our knowledge of where these different centers are continues and includes plans to expand the regional study area and the application of new technologies such as drone-based photogrammetry and LiDAR. 40 years of research coordinated and supported by Crow Canyon has enabled sustained growth in our understanding of the largest ancestral Pueblo villages in the Mesa Verde region. And much has been learned about them and the important social, religious, economic, and political roles they played in Pueblo life and the history of the region. And we look forward to Crow Canyon's future work as it continues to build on this long and productive trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. That was incredibly comprehensive. It was really fun to see all of the sites Crow Canyon and others have worked on in this region kind of all flying by. So it's really, really great. We've got some questions. Oh, well, let's start with one from our longtime associate and board member, Tim Kohler, who says, thanks for the great talk, Donna. An eminent southwestern archaeologist recently suggested to me that multi-wall structures in the 1200s might be elite residences. What's your take on that?
All right, that's a great question, Tim. You know, the multi-walled structures, you know, from what we know, do have artifacts that suggest there could be domestic use, but then also other more specialized use. And they could be residents for the elites. They definitely are more exclusive in what they are because they do, they are much smaller. It's not like a Great Kiva where you can have a lot more people coming. So I do think it's a really important and maybe likely possibility, you know, but I also don't know, you know, I just don't know how ceremonial cycles and ritual works also. And so there may be potentially other explanations in there, but it's certainly a specialized, much more exclusive architecture. And it's really interesting to me that when they come into being, most of them, there's like 5 at Aztec. And so it seems pretty linked to Aztec. And their people aren't, you know, villages don't have great houses anymore. They're not really building great houses anymore. So in my mind, it is connected to that and some evolution of how people are viewing and seeing those spaces.
Awesome, thank you. We have a question that it's kind of a long question, but I think the gist of it is maybe wanting you to talk a little bit more about what constitutes a community center, maybe beyond the traditional archaeological sort of notions. The question is around how you define a community center early in the presentation with respect to physical evidence, structures, kiva, etc. And the questioner wants to know, have there been studies or research as to the social constructs that might constitute a community center, norms, autonomy, collective buy-in that would have enabled a community to first be established?
So, so perhaps the processes that pulled people together to make their villages more centralized and aggregated. You know, I think there are a lot of different ways that people kind of come into being with each other, but it really starts with families and households. And it also, I think in terms of some of the places that these community centers have grown, they're really just the largest central pueblos, right? And so many of them are really situated in good locations. It gets harder later in the 1200s. So I'm trying to wrap, you know, all this together in one big thing, but there's going to be so many exceptions to this. But a lot of them really are in places where you have good access to agricultural fields and have access to water, and so that would attract people initially. And then you do have the you know, social interactions and how families work and families growing and expanding and then trying and needing to have other connections so that they can, get what they need in this uncertain environment. So there's certainly those dynamics are involved, and there are studies where people are, trying to think about sort of, what are sort of different relationships and gendered relationships and how like lithic procurement. Fumi Arakawa has done a study in that, and so you do have those dynamics that are there as well that are obviously a little bit harder to get at.
Fantastic, thank you. We have another question around trade. This viewer asks, you mentioned there was indications of trade between the centers. Is there also indications of wider trade from outside this region, and from where?
Yeah, there is. I think, interestingly, on the whole, during the Chaco era, that's when you see sort of the lots of widespread exchange that's happening, right? And so at that time, you'd start to see a lot more obsidian and turquoise and even macaws and copper bells make it up here. And so that was really going great guns. But in the Pueblo III period, all that seems to contract and break up in different ways. And so that kind of trend of more localized exchange that you can see in the large villages is also, representative of what's happening in the region as a whole as people are renegotiating. So, then, it depends on what period you're really talking about. So a lot of the things I mentioned from during the Chaco area are coming up from various places in the South, in New Mexico and Arizona, and even beyond that. During the Pueblo III period, a lot of the exchange is happening, and it depends on what you think of as long distance exchange, right? So when I'm talking about some of the localized exchange, it's thinking about just, maybe that part of the Miguelmo area. Within that area, people were meeting their needs with pottery more often than not, but you still have exchanges that are coming, like especially red wares that are coming from Southeast Utah, and some that are coming up from New Mexico as well.
Fantastic, thank you. So here's one from me, Donna. You have such an incredible breadth of experience. You've been working so long in the Southwest. I was wondering if there's some things that stand out for you that have changed in your mind since you first started working at Castle Rock in 1994 to now.
Changed in terms of just anything? Is that where your perspective, some of your initial questions and impressions and approach to this archaeological landscape, kind of as your career and your research has evolved over time, or there's some big themes of things in your mind? Okay, I'm on it now.
Okay.
For me overall, just the connectivity between people and between areas, that has just increased in my mind, and thinking about how that worked and just how fluid and dynamic people are, and Pueblo people were, and how we aren't probably accounting nearly enough for that. I remember when I started as an intern, my MA thesis research was just trying to show pottery production between and I focused on Castle Rock and Sand Canyon, but also Mug House and Longhouse. And until that time, when you would come up to the park, people would really just talk about what was happening in the park. And, when you were not in the park, people were kind of talking about the park, but mostly focused on, Sand Canyon locality, but we're more inclusive. But there actually wasn't, everybody was just inferring from, there had to have been connections, but there wasn't a whole lot of information. And so, when I did that neutron activation analysis, it was one of the times where you can point to and say, see, look, these pots were made with clays that you could only get up at Mesa Verde on the Cuesta. It's Menifee shale. And these pots, ended up in Sand Canyon, and Castle Rock, in important structures. And then vice versa, you could point to Longhouse and Mughouse and say, look, these pots were made with clays that were only available off. And so you had that connectivity. And I think, that has only increased in lots of complex ways in research since then. So yeah, that's the first thing that came to mind.
No, I love connectivity. It's something we talk about an awful lot still at Crow Canyon. That's very cool. We have a question that's come in about community centers and farming. And our viewer asks, it appears that Canyon of the Ancients has the largest concentration of community centers. Do you think soil quality for farming, sources of water, or religious reasons support the larger population in the area? Does your research consider the size of farming areas near the community centers?
Yeah, well, and this is, many people are doing this research. And so some of the things that I showed to support the agricultural productivity are work by Tim Kohler, who just asked a question, and Kyle Basinski as part of the village ecodynamics. And so looking at kind of the viability of maize productivity and paleo productivity for these different areas, and we have looked specifically at the community centers and whether the land that was most immediately available to them would have been able to support the population, and it seems like especially in the early to mid 1200s. The spots where people were establishing the new villages that grew and became what we're calling community centers today were not necessarily in some of the best farmland too. So increasingly it got harder and harder for people to find adequate spaces. And I think that that too relates to that trend that we could see in the broader village ecodynamics study that was authored by Dylan Schwendt and many others of us, where you can really see that, okay, if there's not enough spaces, you've also got these people, when things are good, it seems like you can live in places that you can't. And so then they would, move into those places as well, and then would run into trouble, and that, created real frictions and hardships for people. But I think, in terms of the agricultural land, yes, I think many of those centers do have among the best lands available, but it gets harder and harder when you have so many of those large villages coming together, and that's research that Mark Berrien was really involved with. And I guess the other thing that I would say is that actually some of the best farming soils are on the Mesa Verde Cuesta. Moorfield Canyon has some of the best soil in the region, which is another reason why you have a lot of that. A lot of the centers forming there and having that high concentration on the Cuesta.
That's great. Thank you. Kind of maybe a follow-up or branching off of that, we have a viewer who's asking, are there sites where one can recognize where the leadership and or water control mavens lived and or farmed?
Where the leader, well, and that's that's kind of relating to the question that Tim asked, right? It's like, where are the people who have the power living? It could very well be, the multi-walled structures and that, and I don't know, I'm just, I've been thinking about Farview a lot since that's been the most recent project. And there are definitely, big buildings that are great houses. There might even, you could also maybe make a case for having two buildings that might be great house-like. But the extent of water management there, I'm just trying to get back to the water maven thing. But the extent of the water management there really required everybody to take part in maintaining any kind of irrigation ditch system that was associated with the Farview Reservoir, and that's some of the stuff that we're working on now. It's the community that's making that happen, but that doesn't mean that there weren't political leaders or high religious leaders that were at Farview House and Pipe Shrine, because that those are two structures are really connected, you know, that were the ones who were in charge of it. But that's a hard question to ask, right? Because you're looking at these villages and then trying to see how all that relates.
I do like the introduction of the water maven terminology. So. I'm gonna take advantage of my access to you right now, because I've always been interested in, I know that you teach a class called The World at 1200, which I've always really wished that I could come and take from you, and I was wondering what inspired you about your work in the Mesa Verde region to create that, and are there that curricula, and are there some things that really pop out of that for you that you think people who mostly know about the Southwest, like our audience, would find particularly interesting?
Well, sure. But I will first say that I actually came up with the idea when I first started doing archaeology a long time ago in the Midwest. And I was working at Sunwatch Archaeological Park is what it's called now. But when I started there, it was run by the Dayton Museum of Natural History, which it still is. But they were installing new exhibits and making it kind of a living museum, because there's a lot of reconstruction it's all kind of post-hole archaeology. So a lot of the houses had been reconstructed. There's a lot of experimental archaeology that was happening there. Made in a museum, there was a timeline that I had to walk by a lot as I worked there, and I was giving tours, and it brought up all the things like Genghis Khan, the Magna Carta, you know, everything that was happening in Angkor, and all of these different, and samurais, and all these different things that were happening in 1200. So that's when I got the seed for this idea. I was like, wouldn't it be cool to put all this together? Because it was a really helpful exhibit to be like, wow, this is, you know, what was going on. And it was, I just thought it was done particularly well. So then, of course, I came out here, learned a lot more about the 1200s and Pueblo histories here, and then got this opportunity to teach this class where we travel all over the world. We start in Southeast Asia, and then we move to the Americas. And when I start, and I don't really do too much on Europe, but we do use primary literature where you can. So we're reading things that were written in the 1200s or very close to the 1200s. And then, of course, that changes when we get to America. So I guess two things really quickly that have stood out to me from teaching the class with respect to thinking about the Southwest and the globe. One is that when you talk about the rest of the world, and then you try to talk about Chaco and Mesa Verde, it's really, you start to realize that, yes, you know, some of the terminologies surrounding whether it was a state or not don't really work very well, especially, you know, given Pueblo perspectives. And but when you're comparing it to the rest of the world, it is like that. And so thinking about Chaco, it has helped me think differently about Chaco and the relationship of Chaco and Aztec as these bigger things. And you know, so some of the things that Steve Lexon's been talking about for years resonated a lot more in different ways. I might talk about it a little bit differently, but still that scale thing is actually more present than I would have thought I did think. Let's put it that way. And then the other thing, this is not really to do with kind of relating to the Southwest, but what's been very fascinating to me is that when I'm teaching on the other side of the world and we have the primary literature that we can draw from, when I get to the Americas, because I also do South America and Mesoamerica, when you're just relying on the archaeology, the students have a harder time thinking about that as knowing what happened in the past. Or even, so it's just been that's been really interesting. And I think it's an interesting thing for Crow Canyon to be thinking about as to how to, because it obviously, you know, for them wasn't really resonating that learning this stuff from the material record from the past was as accurate as something that somebody wrote for a Khan, right? That had a political agenda. So anyway, those are the two things that popped in.
Boy, that's really That's very interesting in a lot of ways. I mean, it kind of you know, makes the written record is something obviously that's easier for students to understand, or more meaningful, but it's also very you know, Western centric, maybe Eastern centric in some places. I mean, I wonder, do you get the perception or the sense that that they maybe didn't appreciate the literate or written cultures that don't have a history of written language?
No, I didn't think it was that so much, and especially when I talk a lot about oral histories, and we read different oral histories, but they're not oral when you're reading them. But I think the hang up for them was that there was so much that we just didn't know that we don't really know, right? Because there was so much missing, so much uncertainty, it was hard to really take what the archaeology was saying and think that was actually it, because there are all these other possibilities. Like, yeah, I think living with uncertainty is a challenge for humans, and this was just another place that I think was playing a role.
That's interesting. Worthy of some thought and consideration for sure. Let's see, we have some more questions coming in. All righty. Well, there's some compliments that I should pass on, like really interesting stuff, a wonderfully comprehensive overview, some great compliments coming in as well. But let's see, we have trying to kind of give people some priority in order. In addition to a thank you, this viewer asks, I'm wondering if you see any analogs of what you've seen in the Four Corners region to other parts of the world for those of us who work elsewhere now.
I'm not quite sure how to go about answering that question without like a specific area or focus, right? I mean, that's pretty broad. So I'm not sure what kinds of analogs this person has.
Maybe sort of questions that are important to archaeologists in the Southwest that you might have observed would be particularly also meaningful in other areas of the world or country.
Well, I think, thinking about how people come together and do what needs to be done in order to live in the places that they want to, in the ways that they that are them and a part of their culture and their identity, and the different ways that happens. Thinking about the relationship between socially what it takes to do those things and sort of the physical realities of landscapes and places that you live and access to resource, and the different ways that people deal with that and how it changes over time, I think, are translatable across the board. I'm sorry, I'm probably just not quite catching what this person wanted. They're welcome to contact me later, and I can follow up.
Let's see. Well, we've got about 3 minutes left, and we have a question around the relationship between the cultural change, social change that you're studying, and conflict, or sort of, the questioner asks, does culture change? Can you see that it has a political power motivation in some cases?
Well, yes, and culture change and change in general, it's I think what's so hard to understand about large scale changes is that it's the convergence of multiple things that come at the same time, and it's how do you understand when they come together, what has the most, it's hard to say that one thing has more influence than another, but I think it's those convergences, and that's sort of where I'm trying to focus thinking about it. How do you tease out all these different lines? I will say that, in terms of politics and, and that's, very much about religious change. Here, like, I do think that change was happening, and that was part of what made it really difficult in the 1200s, because you have all these environmental factors and all these other things happening, when at the same time there is very different ideas about whether or not you wanted to continue being a part of this bigger thing that was Chaco or Aztec. Right. And so I think it's kind of breaking apart in people, and there's that political change that's happening. And so that also creates fractures and makes it possible for other things to have more effect than they would have normally. Right. And we're seeing that same kind of thing now. If you have stability in governance and access to resources, and then you can weather some of the different, that was an unintended pun, but intense climatic things that are happening a little bit better. But when you have different, insecurities and uncertainties in all of those areas at the same time, that's when you get these bigger changes that happen.
Very cool. Thank you. We're right at 5 o'clock, so I will finish with one question, which I don't know if it's possible, but one of our viewers asks, how can I take your class?
I wish it was possible. I'd be happy to talk to people about it, but I think you have to enroll for the credits at Notre Dame.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Donna, and for saying and answering lots of questions, which can be hard to do when you can't kind of follow up with a little bit more context. But
right. Well, I have a hard time when I can't see people's faces.
The Zoom world, it's tricky for sure. But everyone, please feel free, if you can email to crowcanyon.org, and we'll be happy to hook you up with Donna for any follow-up with any of the questions. And Donna, thank you so much. And I'm sorry that I'm on vacation. I'm going to miss you on campus tomorrow. So.
Oh, that's not a problem. Thank you all for your time and attention. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. See you next week.
Okay.